So the official title of this is Visions of Reality, which sounds really big. I had some friend of mine online who's, I remember meeting him at Labrie, talking for hours and hours and hours about his psychedelic acid experiences. And I won't give you what we talked about, but I just wrote somewhere, I think on Facebook, that I was giving this lecture, and he said, "What was it?" And I said, "Visions of Reality." He goes, "Oh, please do tell." And I said, "Wait for the video." So the reason I'm calling this is another title could be Three Visions of Reality. I am just turned a couple of weeks ago 67 years old. And that means, I've been around a few years. And what it really means to me, though, is I have seen three distinct ages. And I'm using the word ages in a way, but for instance, when we talk, I could talk about eras, but many of these ages have eras within them. Or you could talk about decades, but it doesn't really fit neatly into these categories. So I'm just right now using the word ages. You'll see what I mean. But for instance, when I was young, I started becoming conscious. I remember in 1963 when President Kennedy was shot, I was in school and they came in and they announced this. And then we went home early from school, and the children were some of the girls were crying and stuff. And then we watched this thing on television all week and watched Lee Harvey Oswald get shot. And then by 1967, we were in a different world. And I don't mean we'd just gone into a different place. I mean, I was growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I was sitting in the front row seats of the changes that were going to happen in San Francisco. I remember seeing the first hippie I had ever seen. And this isn't like there were others anywhere else. There were none anywhere else. So this didn't look to me like, your granola friend, that you saw, yeah, they're a hippie. No, they weren't a hippie. I saw the real things. I consider that most hippies disappeared by around 1973, and after that you had something else. But what I realized later was that I was privileged to see the world up until, let's say, around the age of 12. Well, let's say 1967. I was privileged to see the world before this huge change came. And the more I look back at it, for instance, a lot of you, has anyone watched film noir, these old crime detective films, Humphrey Bogart, the black and white, or really dark? I'm going to talk about them a little bit more. But that language they spoke was the language related to the language I remember hearing when I was growing up. And then it all changed. On the other end, though, I just recently realized, while I was doing my How We Got Here series, that there was another huge change that came. And at first I thought, oh, it's the internet. And I thought maybe it's changing literally around the year 2000. The internet became, I think, popular on a mass level around, I don't know, probably 1996 or so. But people were still acting the way they normally did by then. And it wasn't until we had not just the cell phone, but the smartphone, until we had social media. And that took a little while to develop. So this is like 2005, 2007. We started getting things like Facebook and Twitter and then Instagram. And as these things started to develop, and also the sites in the background like Reddit and Tumblr and such, as these things came, they started to radically change the way people looked at everything. For one thing, really brought this home is recently I've been watching, every now and someone that I watch on YouTube mentioned this again this morning, and I wasn't going to really get into this, but it's kind of interesting. There are these videos that come out where someone interviews someone, maybe you've seen them, and they say something like, in America, they would say, "What's the capital of Canada?" And all the people sit there and go, Toronto? Ontario? They don't know. And finally, one guy goes, "Ottawa." And the guy goes, "Where are you from?" Canada. So it's no American knew. But that's kind of on this kind of like, okay, we just don't know much about our neighbors. We don't know much about geography. Standard American affair. But Now the videos are coming out like this. That's about 5 years ago video. Now the videos are like this. And I've been watching these and my mind has been blown. Because the guy will say something like this. What's the capital of the United States? He's talking to Gen Z era Americans. And they would go like, whoa, I don't know that. They'll ask a question like, what's 3 times 3 times 3? And they go, mathematics? I can't do that. This is one of my favorite ones. How many moons do we have in the sky? And this one girl goes, 6?
Yes.
And this sounds really weird. Well, that's exactly how he answers. So he can keep asking him questions. Rather than correct them, he goes, yes, that's right. And yeah, it's called Fleckus Talks is the channel that does this. But it occurred to me, it's like, why? What is happening? Is this just mere stupidity? But I realized some major change has come. And part of it is, I think I've talked to a few people about this. If you know, is there anybody here who knows a lot about washing machines? Okay, that's better. Do you fix washing machines? Okay. So if you were to go buy a washing machine tomorrow, you'd know exactly what washing machine to buy that would save you so much money than you would, what it does. And yeah, see, then nobody really does, really. You might know more. Yeah, exactly. But if you wanted to save money, but here's the thing. If I walk in and buy a washing machine, and I go into a place that sells washing machines, appliances, I could do a week or so of work, which is what I would do, looking up which one should I get. But as soon as I walk in there, the people who sell washing machines immediately know I don't know anything. And they've got washing machines over here that have been sitting too long. They're going to make sure I get that one. And so in that environment, I'm stupid. We are all stupid in certain environments because we don't know. So what's happened is this. Since the advent of social media and this, interestingly enough, all I have to do is this, and everybody knows what I'm talking about. I don't have to tell you. I just hold my hand and act like I'm holding something and waving my fingers around, and you know I'm talking about this highly symbolic device that most of us have. I don't. But this is what is happening now. People are doing this, and they're just like, ooh, lol, check out the picture. They're looking at this, and that's what they know. They no longer know anything about the world. So they don't know how many moons there are. They don't know the capital of not only the country next door, but their own. Now, obviously, this isn't everyone. But this is, and I realize this is a radical break. We have entered something new here. And so that's what I want to talk about, is what I've noticed about this. And I'm going to break it down. Now, I was asked to make this an hour-long thing. If anyone's ever seen any of my videos, you know I don't do... No, I'm not. I'm going to make it an hour or less, I hope. What time is it? You see, we didn't get started. Oh, that is menacing. So, okay, 2:30-ish I started. So... But no, what I've decided I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through this material as is, and then down the line I'm going to make one on my channel that's like 2.5 hours long with all the things I'm referencing here. So what I witnessed when I was a child was the end of what we will call the modern age. And the modern age lasts from 1914, the beginning of the First World War, until 1967, to give it a date, when the first hippies really exploded, and more importantly, when the media reported on them and got hundreds of thousands of people crossing the country and coming from Europe to go to San Francisco and get high and enjoy sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so there's a huge gap right there. Now, there are other periods. For instance, prior to this, I would call the age before this long struggle, we call it the war between rationalism and romanticism. And this starts somewhere in the, we'll just say 1750 to give it a rough date. And obviously with these dates, for instance, they aren't solid because no historical data is solid. Things don't just, bam, everything changes. But for instance, in Russia, this modern age went up until 1989 or so. In China, it's probably still going on, because last time there was a new age development there, this group Falun Gong, the Chinese government just squashed it and started arresting everyone. So China is still in some sort of weird version of the modern age. But most people in Western Europe and in America entered this new world around 1967. But before that is this long period that we'll call the war between rationalism and romanticism. And there's all these strange things. So there's rationalism, but then romanticism comes along as a reaction to romanticism, or rationalism. But then you have, like in art, you have realism. In novels, like Emile Zola and these people, you have this realistic depiction of things. Communism starts to come of age. It's all about the hammer and sickle. You know, eventually it becomes about tractors, but that's like realism. But then you have reactions to it, like symbolism. And so you have this war going back and forth, these things. We have the little game for kids called Leapfrog, where one kid sits there and jumps over the other kid and jumps over the other kid. And the name of that game was Leapfrog. I don't know if any kids play it anymore. But these artistic and cultural movements are leapfrogging over each other during this period until modernism wins. Except, if you're going to pay attention to what I'm saying, you'll realize the next moment is another romanticism moment. That is to say, the hippies were essentially another strain of romanticism. But before that is the birth of the modern world, which we'll call the Renaissance. We'll say 1350, right after the Black Death. And then you start getting all of these changes in Europe. Eventually, of course, you get the artistic changes. You get this new perspective. You get the Reformation. And then you get the Baroque era, and eventually it leads up to the Enlightenment. So that's that period. And then going back further, it's just, it really depends where you're living, but there are other eras, obviously. But we'll just say that those are behind the picture here. So, in this modern age that lasts between 1914 and 1967, and you can really see it if you know anything about fashion history, you can really see the clothing radically change about the middle of the teens of 19-teens. And then you start seeing, you know, the jazz age. It's a modernist movement. The art, the buildings all start changing. It's like straight up and down. You know, it was, I've told some people, Adolf Loos, L-O-O-S, wrote an essay called Ornamentation, or Ornament and Crime, where he said essentially to add ornamentation to things that don't need them was a crime. And that eventually includes buildings, forks, knives. And so you start getting things like, you know, Danish modern furniture and all of this. And the whole point is to get rid of ornamentation. So Art Nouveau, I think the last major movement that had some sort of sense of ornamentation was Art Deco. But what's happening is, in this period, you're seeing now the rise of machines and technology. It's starting to really encircle our lives. And during this period, you go from having, in America, you had the ice house. So you had, literally, they would carve blocks of ice out of these lakes in Canada and Northern America. And you get these huge chunks of ice, and they had this way of putting them in an insulated building, usually made out of wood. And this could last through most of the year. It would, of course, lose water as it went. But people had, there's a play called The Iceman Cometh. People would get deliveries of ice. But by the end of this modern era, no one has an ice house or an ice box in their refrigerator anymore. They now have the refrigerator. And this is the kind of changes that are going on in this period. Technology becomes much more important. I would say that during this, for instance, well, let me say this. So there was no sense of transcendence during this period. Very little. Like even the religion of people was very much immanent. It was down on the earth. It was just nuts and bolts stuff. It was like, we're suffering, we need healing, you know. But it wasn't God in this big sense of the word. You know, it wasn't There is one big exception. For instance, many of the arts and such have this down-to-earth quality. If you've seen these old film noir detective films from the 1940s and 50s, they're all like, the metaphors are all gambling, dice, horse racing. But if you listen to black gospel music, however, the black gospel music from this period is astounding. Much better than it would be after the 1960s. Just some of the most incredible music ever made. And of course, that relates to something like the civil rights movement, which I'll mention in a second. But if anyone during this period was to say to you, Byrne, why are you traveling around? I'm imitating my mother. Why are you traveling around to Europe? You're just being a dreamer. You really have to face reality. And obviously I've heard this from my mother, but not only my mother. Lots of people, anyone who is above a certain age would talk like this. They would say, you have to face reality. And what they meant by reality was the stuff on the ground, getting a job, getting insurance. I mean, we still talk like this today, but we also have room for the self. But they talked about facing reality. Reality was hard. They'd come up with sayings like this that would show up in these film noir movies, something like, there's always a bullet with your name on it. It's this very much this dirt level stuff. Boxing was really a huge sport. Here's what's interesting. They never, even though essentially evolution won as far as an idea, no one ever referred to it in daily life the way we do. We are obsessed with saying something like, I'm evolving into, there's a bumper sticker in America that says, and it's based on the old fish bumper sticker that Christians would put on, looking kind of silly, and they'd say Ichthus or Jesus lives or something in the shape of a Christian, of a fish. But this evolved bumper sticker was kind of in the shape of a fish, but with two legs. And it goes, evolve, saying essentially like, you have to evolve, as if that's a definition of evolution. But during this period, when essentially it wasn't a big deal of the Christians had essentially said, okay, we evolved. Nobody actually used that metaphor in daily life. I mean, you can look through, I've watched hundreds of movies from that period. You never hear it. Why? It's just an interesting thing. It's because that's almost too metaphysical for them. They're dealing with nuts and bolts. This is the period when communism really takes hold in Russia, takes hold in many different places. And in America, it's all about labor unions and the working class. It's all ground level stuff. What kind of work will you do? And as the work becomes more technological and someone's working for IBM and such, when someone in the 1950s said computer, they didn't mean anything that you mean when you say computer, because it was a huge embankment of computers with big tapes rolling around on them. And these were just huge machines that, those big computers, you've got one in your pocket that's probably more powerful. But your relationship to computers is radically different. One of the things about modernism, and here I'm not talking about just things that are contemporary, but about the actual philosophy of modernism, which goes into science, goes into art, is that it's all about pulling things apart to kind of get to the truth. One of the interesting things about modernists is they believe in truth, unlike the postmodernists. But when the modernist talks about, like in art, it's like you keep abstracting things until, you get to Jackson Pollock's abstract expressionism or minimalism. You're pulling things apart to get to something. In music, it's like Schoenberg's 12-tone row. We have to figure out a way to make each musical note equal to each other. Equal is a big phrase during this time. But in science, it's like we're going further and further into cells and into atoms, and to what the universe is like. But it's still nuts and bolts stuff. It's still immanent. It's not about transcendence. And in fact, many of the modernist scientists got worried as soon as someone mentioned black hole, because that opens the door for transcendence. So Another thing, goals. What were the goals of people back then? House ownership, savings, joining a labor union, moving to the suburbs, having more than your children had so that you could give more to your children. Having more than your parents had so you could give more to your children. And recovering from the Great Depression and the war. These kinds of things. All very practical, nuts and bolts stuff. When in America they gave what's called the GI Bill, and everyone, all the soldiers got this grant to go to university for free. Nobody was sitting there going like, yeah, we're going to the dorm and we're going to get high. We're going to Duke. I think that's a party college, right? Nobody was saying stuff like that. They were saying like, we're going to go and I'm going to be an engineer and I'm going to learn and I'm going to make money for my family. Or they weren't thinking like we do at all. They just had this very ground level view of the world. One of the things that's really important, well, let me say this. So there are metaphors that they use. Sports is a big metaphor. Baseball in America. I'm sure football here and American football there. But also playing cards are really important. And they weren't looking at the tarot, nor were they looking at a mystical view of playing cards. They were talking about full house, straight flush, whatever. Like I got 4 aces. But if you listen to the movies and the music of the times, it's all metaphors like this. There aren't big metaphors. It's like, at the same time, what's weird about this era is the music in many ways was much softer than anything that would come in the next section. But the people were more dangerous. Frank Sinatra might be crooning, I did it my way. It's this mellow song. But Frank Sinatra was truly dangerous, and the people he hung out with. Whereas the people later might be singing some cosmic ditty about like, where your love like heaven. And Donovan has no danger to him, Later, it's just like, even the punks, I knew a lot of punks firsthand, and it's just like they're pussycats. Really, one of the things that got me is they're wearing black. They got leather. They got their hair short. They look like they're ready for war. And then I'm living on the street in New York City where I'm watching someone get fished out of a car with a big bullet hole in his head. And I'm on the second floor watching it. And all the people watching are black and Hispanic. And as soon as I see someone who kind of resembles me coming around the corner, some sort of come to New York to be cool person, they take a look and go, oh, and they walk away. Because they can't face it, because they don't really understand life and death. But that's later. So what this era is also, drinking was a really big metaphor. There's so many words for being drunk during this period. Of course, that's kind of eternal. But circuses and carnivals were really big. And of course now, circuses have pretty much essentially been, I know in America, almost erased. We don't understand that metaphor at all anymore. It doesn't ring with us the way it would. The man on the flying trapeze means very little to us as a subject. It's just like someone will say, well, have you seen Cirque du Soleil? But it's like a little fluffy entertainment. Where for them, to go to the freak show or to see the geeks, who at that time were people who would do things like bite the heads off chickens or swallow snakes, that meant something to them. Like when they used to go see someone with 3 legs, they were going because they could say to themselves, at least I'm not like this. Later, by the end of the 20th century, people were looking at photos and images of models all the time, and actors, and all these people with perfectly sculpted and chiseled bodies. And they were saying, I wish I could be like that. Do you see the difference? One was saying, I'm glad I'm not. So there's a sense of gratitude. The world is difficult. We don't understand it. But I have more than that poor soul. Whereas this here, we're saying like, I know this girl in Georgia who is just perfectly beautiful. Her nose is a little on the large side, but that doesn't matter. She's still beautiful. But she's saying, I've been thinking about, no, don't go get it cut. But that's us, you see, that's our problem. But, so this is the era of existentialism. Existentialism is another ground level philosophy. Especially in France, they're saying, life is absurd. There's no reason for right or wrong. As Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, you're walking across the street and there's a little old lady. You have two choices. You could help her across the street, or you could push her into the traffic. Neither matter, because morality is absurd. But the point is, that whole thing is just immanent. It's not about transcendence at all. There is no transcendence. This is the modern era. And also, fate is huge. And if you ever watch film noir films, they're amazing. They almost all circle around fate. It's like eventually, like I said, there's a bullet with your name on it. You're going to pay for your sins over and over. You cannot run. You cannot escape. And that's these films from the 1940s and all the way through the end of the 50s. There's so many like this. There were also these really fluffy Hollywood musicals, because there's a whole other thing going on where people were trying to pretend, that era between 1939 and 1945, if you just don't look at it, it will go away. You can relax. And they had albums of people like laying around, often women lounging in a chair, But so fate is really important, and traditionalism is really important. But notice I'm saying traditionalism, not tradition, because traditions are being destroyed through the new machines. So a woman's life in the 1950s is going to not be traditional. She's got a washing machine. She's got an oven that is new, this refrigerator. She doesn't have to go out and do the things women had to do even in the Great Depression, like 10 years before. But she wants to seem traditional. And there are all these like magazines and such that want you to be traditionalists. And we often hear this word now in a kind of a different context. But the point is, again, it's nuts and bolts. It's working with your hands. It's working on the ground. It's not transcendence. And democratic equality was put against something like racism. And at that time, racism meant what it has usually meant up until the recent time. It meant you're prejudiced against someone because the color of their skin or their ethnicity or where they come from or something like that. But that's like racism. And it was those people, the only people who really had this transcendent view of the world at that time, through suffering, redemption, the black gospel music, that you find a movement that's going to go into the future. And that's the civil rights movement. And that's going to color a lot. So there are all these expressions. Like I said, there's film noir, there's the musical, there's gangsters, there's the Western, there's comic books. People played board games like Monopoly or Parcheesi. Has anyone ever played Parcheesi? I haven't. But I used to see these boards all over the place when I was growing up. And there's a woman named Virginia Wilson who wrote a book that was very important to my studies on puppetry. And the name of the book is The Secret Life of Puppets. It's a very strange philosophical book. But one of the things she talks about is the concept of the sub-zeitgeist. There's the zeitgeist, what's happening now, the way a lot of people act. But the sub-zeitgeist is this thing that's not the zeitgeist. It's below it. And it's saying things to the population that are really different than the main message being given through most of the main organs of culture. And so in this period, you find things like rock and roll is a sub-zeitgeist. It kind of takes over the kids. It's still connected to folk music, still very traditional. I can always tell when a 1950s song is from Kansas City or from New Orleans. I just hear it and go like, Huey P. Moe is like New Orleans. It's like this country song is from somewhere near Galveston. You can hear it if you know what you're looking for. But rock and roll, though, had something else in it that wasn't going to become clear for a little while. The Beats. The Beats were essentially the precursors to the hippies. They were similar in many respects to the existentialists. There weren't a lot of them, particularly as they started. There were only 3 in the beginning. William S. Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg. But they multiplied slowly, and they're the first ones to really start bringing in Eastern religion, to really start using drugs, particularly marijuana and heroin, though they did not have any access to any psychedelics, any true psychedelics. But they emphasized transcendence. They emphasized religiousness, not specifically Christian religion, but just a general sense of the religious. They were very similar to the existentialists, but the existentialists in France looked at them and said, no, this is wrong, because you're just doing this religious kind of Zen. They were the first ones to start talking about Zen and stuff, and they said, no, this is absurdity. We don't go that way. So the French were always a bit more like, no, you stay away, to the beats. But the beats are actually the guys who are holding the keys to the future, to the next age. But there's also, in this period, the first postmodern art starts to show up. And the first postmodern artist shows up in this movement called pop art. And it was Andy Warhol. And he starts doing things like painting Campbell's soup cans. Now, already at this point, you had abstract expressionism, and abstract expressionism says the only reality in the painting is the actual paint on the canvas. Again, no transcendence. But Andy Warhol's bit does this weird sleight of hand, magic maneuver, where he says, the pop artists are doing things like Jasper Johns is painting an American flag and such. Andy Warhol's painting Campbell's soup cans, and Marilyn Monroe, who had already died by this point. And there's kind of saying to the critics, these aren't really the images you see. These are really like Jackson Pollock. These are just paint on canvas. If you see an image in there, that's kind of on you. But it's just paint on canvas. That's all art is anymore. But in fact, Warhol was doing something else. He was basically saying, this is art. And by doing so, by making the quotations around it, and people recognize this is something radically weird here. And he's also not even doing it himself. He's hiring someone else to do the printing. He's saying, this is art, but he's putting it in quotation marks. And what he's doing is he's saying, yeah, in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes and have a YouTube channel. And so it's, another sign of what's about to come. The folkies started doing these folk songs and stuff. Well, they're still part of this communist, socialist sort of thing. And they're very nuts and bolts. They're singing songs about, people fighting each other in the hills of Kentucky, of which none of them know anything about. But out of there is someone who is going to change everything. But then you have things like Mad Magazine. Mad Magazine was this weird comic magazine in America which just makes fun of everything. So they had a takedown of the film The Sound of Music. And the name of they had cartoons, and it was called The Sound of Money. And then they figured, the lyrics to the song. So what they would do is they would write these really sarcastic lyrics to all of the songs, so that instead of dough, dear, and then they go like, dough is money I want for me. So they would change everything into this really cynical interpretation. But so many people would be influenced by this because it was bought mostly by kids. The very kids who are going to be a certain age by about 1967. And then science fiction and fantasy, these cheap little movies that were made. Again, if you look at the 50s science fiction and fantasy movies, it looked like they're made out of cardboard boxes spray painted silver, because some of them are. It's just very cheap sets and such. But you throw them out for the kids, they'd watch them on a Saturday morning, and they'd be like, that was fun. But again, these kids are going to grow up. And in about 1977, they're going to find a movie that makes all their dreams come true, and it's called Star Wars. But they're the same kids who when they were very young, they were watching these cheap little science fiction movies. So that is the modern age. And that world of Mad Magazine, of rock and roll, of folkies, of pop art, that was the world when I was young. That was the world that there was. And for instance, it's interesting, in the 1960s, there are actually, most people think, okay, and then there were the hippies. But no, there was another image of coolness that almost won, except for these pesky hippies and all the acid and everything. And this was the James Bond aesthetic. It was the Playboy magazine aesthetic. Again, it was the beginnings of sexual liberation. But again, none of it transcendent. All dirt level stuff. It's like you need to give in to your urges. Why? Freud, Kinsey, whatever. So the next age goes like this. We'll say it goes from 1964, right after President Kennedy's death, all the way through to 2012. And 2012 is the time when people started noticing students acting very differently in universities. That is to say, being offended at everything. So this era, I'm calling the age of transformation. And it is an age of irrationalism. Almost everything in this period is irrational. Its ethnic traditions are both invoked and destroyed. They're invoked because of the folkies, but they're destroyed by all the technology used to create folk rock. Or later in the 1970s, there would be people who were selling these, how to be a successful Italian American or something. They would turn it into a thing, a commodity to buy and sell, just as during the 1970s, running became a commodity, and therefore the running shoe. The running shoe didn't exist before the 70s, not as we understand it, the ones you all got with the little stripes on it. That was a 1970s kind of invention. But they were actually selling you a dream. And the dream was perfect health. There's this other thing called the New Age movement. But during this period, here's the main value that jumps to the top. It is about transcendence. And it's about the idea that individual freedom transcends everything. This is the period of the creation of what's been called the sacred self. The one main value.
What did it do to architecture?
That's a good question. Well, we eventually did get postmodernism, but the thing about architecture, especially by the mid-20th century, is it takes a long time to plan architecture. It costs a lot of money to make architecture, and it takes a lot of payoffs of bribes to build architecture. And so what happens is architecture becomes more and more corrupt, literally, as it goes. But eventually you start getting people like Frank Gehry and I.M. Pei and these other postmodern people. So what they do is they will design essentially a modern building, big, tall skyscraper, tons of windows and stuff, and then put the top of a Sheraton antique chair on the top, or they give it a twist. Like I've got two buildings right near my house in Georgia, very late postmodern stuff, that are twisted going up. And me and a friend of mine who's an American, and he's really into architecture, we go like, yeah, they're just showing off that they can do this with the materials, but it doesn't mean anything. And we'll see why as we see how this age ends. But good question there. This is the period where people start talking about evolution. And the further it goes, the more they talk about evolution in the sense that we, the people who believe in the sacred self, and will, and the Holy Trinity is sex, drugs, and rock and roll here. We are the people who have evolved over those pinheads, those microcephalics, those idiots from the past, those modernists. But what they would do is find anybody from the past who somewhat agreed to them and make them a saint. And they started to, they tried to adopt someone like Dostoevsky, but Dostoevsky is a bit too prickly to fit into this model. So you would still see people reading Dostoevsky. You'd still see people reading the great literature of the past. But more and more, something's going to change. So evolution, evolve. It's like a command. You've got to evolve. Start now. Will it? But evolution is also always in conjunction with progress. The evolved thing is always better than the unevolved thing. Whereas I think a proper view of evolution would just simply say things change, they adapt, they do this. But I think there's a lot more than that. I don't want to get off on that too far. But this is also the period where suddenly everyone's getting involved with spiritual techniques. the hippies lead directly into the New Age movement. So, like I said, the real hippies are between, we'll say, in San Francisco, about 64. There's a small commune in the hills of Santa Clara. And that was the Ken Kesey group who drives around the bus. And they kind of impregnate everyone with this new idea. And they're acting like children. And in fact, the whole juvenilization of society starts at this point as well. And there are scenes where, if you just look for, go to do an image search or do a video search for hippies dancing, 1967. What you will find is groups of people holding hands. They're all totally pickled in the punch, but they are dancing, and they all look like kids going, ah, and you see these blissed out expressions on their faces. It's no wonder that Joseph Campbell became really popular during this whole epoch, because he's emphasizing the same things, this follow your bliss. So the hippie thing, though, transforms into, it kind of shoots off in different places, but mostly the hippie energy, and energy is another one of those words that becomes really important. You find no one, I dare anyone to go watch, say, all the films of Humphrey Bogart. There's about 70 of them. And find one reference to the concept of my energy, your energy, the energy of this place. That's one of these phrases that's from this era. And it turns into spiritual techniques, known also as the New Age movement. It's also the time when Eastern religion comes in. Like, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I had a ringside seat to all of this. By about 1975, there was a documentation that there were approximately 70 new cults in the San Francisco Bay Area alone. And I met quite a few people from most of these cults when I was about 20 or so. So, but spiritual techniques, yoga, TM, transcendental meditation, all these techniques for essentially making the sacred self sacred, for improving yourself, but also the whole emphasis on health. It's about, Tom Wolfe astutely called the 70s the me decade, because he noticed that essentially it was all about me, developing me, which also means it wasn't about you, and it wasn't about anybody else. It was about me. So I'm running, and jogging came before running. I'm getting the jogger's manual, although Jim Fix, the first guy to put out this really successful jogging book, died of a heart attack while jogging, but that was in the 80s, when we could kind of look back on these things with way too much irony. And in fact, irony is a key thing here. We'll talk about that in a moment. But so technology increases ever more, because this is also the era where there is a continuity between the hippies and the drugs and Silicon Valley. And Steve Jobs just goes right through both. And Steve Jobs is also into the spiritual techniques. And Steve Jobs also holds the utopian idea that the internet and the computers are going to set us free. And this is all part of one thing. The hippies and being online in 1996 are not two separate events. They are all part of this one era. They are also transcendent events. These things are supposed to help you. What are they supposed to help you find? Truth? No. Your truth, yes. But are they supposed to help you help society? Some people thought that maybe if we all did, this or that would help. But really, it's about you. And in fact, I remember I had friends in New York City, really strange countercultural friends, who would say things like, yeah, I really like the words of Jesus. And when he said, love your neighbor as yourself, well, before you can love your neighbor, you've got to love yourself. And he wasn't joking or being ironic. So he's going to spend the me time. You've heard that expression. I got to put time into me. It's about me. So the sacred self. But technology then becomes a key to the sacred self. It's all right. I keep telling people I've spent too long in Georgia. Nothing. It's like in Georgians. Some huge thing can happen. Like, for instance, when COVID came to Georgia, Nobody was doing what the Americans were doing, panicking, buying all the toilet paper and stuff, because they looked at this as going like, yeah, we were in a civil war 10 years ago. We had that war with Russia in 2008. Yeah, we've gone without electricity. What's this going to do? And the truth is, they spent the whole time, they were like, yeah, it's just a pandemic. Whereas other parts of the world, especially America, and I think it's this attitude. America has spent so much time being such a place with so many material possessions, largely created by those people from the earlier eras, that they passed on to their rather spoiled boomer children. I am a boomer, I confess. You know, but so are all the people under me, just as spoiled or more. But passed on all this stuff to us. We had, in a sense, we had this amazing bank account of the history, and Europe did as well. Europe tended to throw it all away in around 1945, you know, or actually before then. They just, you know, we're going to throw this all away. You know, we have the capital, but Europe still had capital left, this emotional, this societal capital, which is the reason why Europe still works, is because you're building on what people have been building here for well over 1,000 or more years, you know, since sometime in the Middle Ages. The capital of the way you're living your life now was being accumulated. But America, though, has been squandering its capital. Freedom, great, you know, I'm going to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Well, whose happiness are we talking about? Society's? No, mine. And that's what this era became more and more about. But here's the thing. These people all living for themselves didn't understand, you know, those people who were modernists, who were pulling people apart. Well, they got really good at their technologies of things like advertising and things like, social control. And they started, they wanted to make money. That's what their main goal. But underneath that is, in order to make money, you have to have the right kind of people. And it's much better to have people who believe only in themselves, that their highest goal, and this is where this comes in, is finding your personal identity. Because they know they can shape your identity. You see? And most people in America, I know it works this way, I don't know how it works in your own countries, but I'm sure you've been influenced by this somehow. Most people in America, Americans are great about just sharing too much with other people. You know, Europeans, especially like Germans and Swiss, and, you know, I don't know about the Dutch, but nobody knows about the Dutch. But they're like much better at holding things in for a while. You know, they don't, you know, when you meet a German person, if you meet a German woman, you don't find out by the end of the first meeting that she had an abortion when she was 20. That is something you might find out from an American. I remember someone telling me about a taxi ride they had from Los Angeles, and by the time they got there, that was a female taxi driver. By the time they got home, they'd found out the woman had been divorced twice, and she had an abortion. And so Americans pride themselves on understanding their personal psychology. You know, I'm working on myself. But the truth is, the folks who actually understand, you know, meanwhile, the large corporations are working on this thing called mass psychology that nobody knows anything about. And that's how they can just show you a picture of a Coke can, and it works. They don't have to show you anything else but the little red and white Coke label. And they just go, yeah, that's all we need to show them. You know, that'll work. And there are ads that you know, I remember in the 1990s, there was an ad for Coke. They showed people playing in a playground in, like, I don't know, somewhere near New Delhi or Bombay or something. Bombay, it was then Mumbai now. And they just showed this, and you're going, what is this an advertisement for? And at the very end, there's a Coke label on the wall. That's how devious and how much these people have pulled apart human personality back in the modernist era. And there are all these books in the 1950s, like The Organization Man, you know, but even all those books about sex and everything. Essentially, they're saying, wow, how can we make this work for us to get what we want? And of course, these people haven't actually disappeared anywhere. They're still out there. They're in corporations. But it isn't any person there that has the information. It is the techniques they use for just simply selling and buying. And the governments have these techniques as well. And these are kind of an inheritance from the modernist era that then gets passed down and certainly still active now. So what happens by the end of what I'm calling the Age of Transformation is that art, music, culture, meaning eventually all become consumed within a consumerist model. So that I'm sure Paul can tell you all about church hopping, where you're shopping for a church like it's an item on a menu somewhere. I think one of the reasons for the Orthodox revival of recent times is the Orthodox just don't change. So that's pretty powerful in the face of all this other stuff that believes in change and believes change is the only thing. An interesting side note, as those people from the earlier age of the middle of the 20th century got older, eventually they were going to retire. And if you went to a gambling casino in about 1995, most of the people gambling there would be older people, very gray, white hair, going bald, whatever, and they'd be sitting there in front of a slot machine, putting endless quarters or dollars in there. They'd be sitting at tables gambling. And this is one of the main things that so many older people did during that period. And the question is, wait a minute, what are you doing with this money that you were going to pass on to your children? Because this is what they're using. And the answer I got from when I lived in New York City in the 80s was, we don't know what they're doing anymore. They're going crazy. We'd rather not pass our money on to them. We'd rather just have a good time ourselves and essentially screw the boomers and everybody younger than them, because so many of the people said, we don't understand them anymore. We don't know what they're doing. We hope they die. I would hear people, and in Alaska, I remember we had people from the silent generation. Those people of the age of my mother. They're still around there. They're now in their 90s. But they would be there taking this trip, and then you talk to them about their, 55, 60-year-old children, and they would go like, they just looked at all the sex, drugs, and rock and roll and said, you are ruining your life. We don't want you to have this. Not everyone, obviously, but far too many people. And that's why the gambling casinos were full of gray hair. And I remember in New York City, they used to take buses to people down to Atlantic City, and they would just and just be throwing it all away. And every now and then they'd win, and that's a great time. But mostly they were taking the inheritance of their children and making sure they so detested what happened in the 60s. They were making sure their children never got it. And I heard that actually said by them. That is, as I met people, it's just like, they don't deserve it. So it's also the time of postmodern culture and irony. I'm not talking so much about postmodern philosophy as I am talking about a culture of quotes from itself. I mean, if you watch someone like Quentin Tarantino, he's a perfect person from this period. But you start getting this kind of action, like I said, Andy Warhol in the 1960s. Underground comics in the 1970s are extremely scatological and extremely pornographic and extremely ironic. Later, this irony would start to seep through everything. So, you've seen maybe Raiders of the Lost Ark, or you've seen maybe Star Wars. I think a lot of people have seen that who are sitting here, right? Do you realize those are ironic takes on older film serials from the 1940s? And those are kind of commercial reductions of actual adventure stories from the end of the 19th century. And what's happened is now we have so many degrees of mediation. I mean, I could talk for a while on this, but the end essentially is that then you start getting people making jokes, joke movies, like The Mummy is a joke movie based on Indiana Jones. And you start getting, it's like after a while you're in a hall of mirrors and all the mirrors are distorting. But the difference is people aren't saying, oh, this is a nightmare. They're saying, this is great. Because they're also probably on something at the same time. And they're just like, whoa, it's just like the perspective is so strange. But that became the hallmark of the society. After a while, I said to myself, when it came to music, music became about the big wow. It was no longer, even in the 90s, the tail end of the first part of the 90s, you have this really intense grunge and noise and stuff. But by the end of the 90s, it's commercialized versions of that. But then you get Britney Spears, and all these this diva pop from the aughts and beyond, and it's totally cynical, but it's also ironic in these weird ways, because Britney Spears doesn't believe a word she says. She in fact was always saying, I'm a Baptist, to which okay, great. But so social norm, okay, so some of the main expressions of culture at that time are rock music, particularly rock concerts, festivals, rock festivals, other kinds of festivals, Renaissance Fair festivals, things like that, blockbuster movies, mega churches. Mega churches are to Christianity what blockbuster cinema is to movies, what big rock festivals are to rock and roll. It's these big things, and they're all supposed to be transcendent. You're supposed to go there and say, like, oh man, we had the greatest time. You're supposed to go to the churches and just be like swaying in the spirit. You're supposed to go to these movies and go like, oh, I couldn't believe the way they flew through those planets. It's just like, what special effects? Did you see Arnold in that movie? You're supposed to have the big wow experience. That was the culture that developed. There was a dark phase in the 1970s. Like, for instance, the movies then, it's kind of like the apocalyptic mode of existentialism. But people were like, as soon as Rocky first, then Star Wars, then Close Encounters of the Third Kind came along, and then they brought Star Trek, the movie. As soon as that came out, they saw the money that could be made, but also everyone fell for it. And that leads eventually down the line to the Marvel Comics universe and video games, but we'll mention them in a second. But one of the social norms during this period were things like transgression. People would talk, you would read reviews saying, oh, this was just wonderfully transgressive. Transgressive, wonderful. They don't go together. But but also, again, sex, drugs, rock and roll. And then you have, in the religious world, you have things like the Jesus people, charismatic movement, lots more Eastern religion, that more than had ever been in the Western world prior to that. But the sub-zeitgeists are interesting. So you have, underneath it, video games. Video games is going to end up being the mode by which people are not just playing games, but interpreting the world. So if you've ever heard the idea of the simulation theory, that we're all just more intelligent people than us are living, created us, and we're living in a computer simulated game. That's pretty fantastic. That's also about us. But the interesting thing is it takes the movie The Matrix for anyone to come up with that idea. In other words, it's born out of a large spectacle entertainment. But also, you had arcade games that were underground. Dungeons and Dragons was kind of an underground thing. Geekdom itself, meaning all the fandoms and all the people who got crazy about their subjects. I often say the difference between a math scholar and intellectual and a math geek is that the math geek sees math as like a game and has all these gamey kind of jokes and things about it, where the scholar sees the usefulness of it, but he also sees the mystery of it. Interestingly enough, one mathematician who went nuts was fellow Pole Ted Kaczynski, who later became called the Unabomber. And he was so interested in trying to help society in that old modernist mode. And he saw the problems of technology and stuff, and his manifesto was quite interesting. But, he couldn't live in the world of the geek, essentially. And what's interesting is the geek used to be buried underground, and by the end of this period, the geeks have inherited the earth. You know, suddenly all the people who are running everything are all Star Wars people, Marvel people. You know, they argue which, you know, are you Marvel or DC? You know, and video game people, which game are you involved with? You know, did you like, I don't know, there's so many. Yeah. No. But no, I wasn't ready with my list of these. But you get the idea. There are, you know, all of these things, and people take sides on which one they want to be associated with. And that's a very weird thing. It's tribal in a strange sort of way. That has nothing to do with actual life. It's all become abstract. And the hyper-political correctness is another of the sub-zeitgeist, which is going to show up. Until we enter the age now, which essentially has just started, and I won't be taking as long talking about it. And it's like, right now, I don't have a good name for this because you can never tell what a thing is as it's happening. So right now I'm just calling it the fragmented age. But that's, huh? Meta, could just be the metaverse. But no, I don't want to. Essentially, what's happened now is propaganda and ideology have taken center stage. As someone I heard talking recently said, politics is popular art now. And I remember walking into a show in New York City in the late 90s, an art show, and I'd been seeing all this postmodern art, and I walked in, and hanging above me was the carcass of a dead turkey. And I thought, wow, I love the texture of that. And I started going like, well, this could be a really interesting show. And then I started looking at the walls, and I realized it was an anti-meat show. And that's what I mean by propaganda and ideology. And after a while, these became people's religions. They would get the message coming, and the propaganda isn't necessarily coming from above. It's what Jacques Ellul calls horizontal propaganda. We pass it to each other. And the perfect device for passing it to each other, social media. So it's also at an age where we're starting to see now the real tyranny of technology. We're seeing how it controls us, how, you know, I have to, you know, my bank basically just told me if I wanted to continue getting money out of any bank in Europe, I'm going to have to get that. I've been carrying this around. This is a dumb phone. I'm going to have to finally break down and get that smartphone. They're not going to let me live normally without it. Well, any more than a person in 1925 who still had a horse was going to do very much unless they got a car. And that's how these things work. Then now, for most people, at least in the fictional panorama of propaganda, the only real ideology most people believe is the sacred self. It's the only thing left that most people have, is just improving myself, paying attention to myself. How am I feeling? What am I eating? You know, I'm almost done. Wait, I started late. Okay, I'm almost done. Now evolution is referred to constantly. There are contradictory movements moving towards collective action, but it's collective action among all these sacred selves who are essentially selfish. The geeks have inherited the earth. Franchise entertainment is the order of the day. So the geeks, while following their favorite passions, don't seem to realize that most of their favorite passions are created by very large corporations who have a stake in them being exactly who they are. And transhumanism, I think, is the thing which we're going to be facing more of in the future. Particularly, it's going to come to us in the ecological sphere. And as people, right now, I think actually the woke stuff is going to go down a bit because it's overplayed its card on many levels. But people are eventually going to go more paranoid about the environment. And through this, they're going to want to change the sacred self into whatever the new definition is, which in the future will be much more cyborgian, much more of a connection with technology. There's more division, suspicion. It's interesting how most people feel like this is one of the most dangerous times ever, and I think there's a truth to that. And yet if you compare it to, say, I don't know, 1944 in Poland, it's not that dangerous. You know, there was a time in the past that was truly, 70 million people or so is the estimate of how many people died in World War II. Yet we feel absolutely oppressed by the moment. But I think that has a lot to do with the pressure of propaganda coming not only from all the big media organizations, but from each other. And the question is, what's really there? And so, but here are some of the interesting sub-zeitgeists I see. You can get a university level education online, and for free if you look around on YouTube. This is a very strange thing. We have long-form videos. I mean, the reason I have put out some of the very, very, to say it in American speech, long-assed videos, is because I noticed people watching 3-hour videos of Jordan Peterson. And I think Paul's got one that's over 5 hours. He just put another one out that's hefty, all the ones dedicated to Mary Cohan. Yeah. Why do we do that? Because we think somebody cares and someone is paying attention to us. Another sub-zeitgeist thing is what brings us here right now. A thirst, a desire for real dialogue. The dialogue which was killed and almost eliminated during the age of transformation. And finally, I think one of the best things is we see a desire to challenge the modern and postmodern paradigms and a questioning of the sacred self. And I think that's part of what we're doing here, but I don't think we're alone in that by any means. I think there's lots of people out there, even people who have the absolute opposite political beliefs, who are questioning that in different sorts of ways. I think we're moving into a very different world. We don't know what it looks like yet. Nobody knows what the events of this year are going to produce at all. I mean, you know, if I was German right now, I'd be saying, I don't know what even the winter is going to look like, you know? So let me just finish this up by saying one thing. I don't have a better example of this. I used a ball, and Hannah said use the ball again, so I'm going to use the ball. And the ball is like this, and it's just, you know, let's say, okay, we're in Europe, let's call it a European football. Notice I said European football. So I put it here. You got your ball. Now, this just represents reality in some sort. We're not going to get too deep into this analogy. But let's just say the first layer is, there's a layer of paint we're putting on this. So maybe we're putting white paint on this ball, and we'll call that the age of the birth of the modern. Then the next layer is this war between rationalism and romanticism. And then you put another layer, it's going to be purple or something, the age of the modern. And then the next one is this transformation age. And then the last one is wherever we are now. Let's just say it's silver. So here's the thing. Reality's still there. Didn't go anywhere. And if you scratch into it, you'll get to the next layer. And in fact, all of those things, you know, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Romantic era, the Symbolist era, the modern era, you know, all the wars, all of the things learned from these, the philosophy, everything, all the stuff learned during the psychedelic and age of transformation, all the things that are happening now, they're still there. That's why you can dig into it, scrape a little off the surface somewhere, and start to get the benefit of it. And I think that is one of the interesting things about this period, is that we can start. And I'm just going to quickly read this by C.S. Lewis. It's from his book, The Discarded Image, which is, I think, my favorite C.S. Lewis book of nonfiction. And he says this. He's talking about the medieval model. You could say medieval reality and the way they looked at it. And the whole book is about how they looked at it. And I didn't talk about it at all in this, but it's a fascinating book. But he says, I hope no one will think I am recommending a return to the medieval model or the medieval reality. I am only suggesting considerations that may induce us to regard all models in the right way, respecting each and idolizing none. We are all very properly familiar with the idea that in every age the human mind is deeply influenced by the accepted model of the universe. But there is a two-way traffic. The model is also influenced by the prevailing temper of mind. We can no longer dismiss the change of models as a simple progress from error to truth. And one of the things I really want to emphasize in this is that you are essentially how you look out at the world. You're looking at it with certain glasses. We've all been affected, by your country, your language, but you're also affected by your times. But here's the thing. You can correct the defects by looking in the past at other things. I think this is the value for me of reading the Bible. It corrects a lot of defects by giving me something much more substantial and real. And real here, as C.S. Lewis goes along, no model is a catalog of ultimate realities. And none is a mere fantasy. Each is a serious attempt to get in all the phenomena known at a given period, and each succeeds in getting in a great many. But also, no less surely, each reflects the prevalent psychology of an age almost as much as it reflects the state of that age's knowledge. Hardly any battery of new facts could have persuaded a Greek that the universe had an attribute so repugnant to him as infinity. And hardly any such battery could persuade a modern that it is hierarchical. It is not impossible that our own model will die a violent death, ruthlessly smashed by an unprovoked assault on new facts, which I would argue is what's been happening in particularly the last 3 years. And he says, as unprovoked as the Nova of 1572. But I think it is more likely to change when and because far-reaching changes in the mental temper of our descendants demand that it should. That's C.S. Lewis from The Discarded Image. Thanks.